Having now taken you to the end of Mongol rule in China, we move westwards in our histories of the Mongol Khanates. Our next stop is the Middle Khanate, the Ulus of Chagatai. Encompassing much of Central Asia, the Khanate ruled by the descendants of Chinggis Khan's second son Chagatai is perhaps the most poorly known. In our first episode on the Chagataids, we'll take you through their history in the 13th century, touched on often in previous episodes, but now receiving its own focus. From efforts at reconstruction by Mahmud Yalovach and his son Masud Beg, to stability under the regency of the widow Orgina Khatun, to disasters in battle at Herat, to domination under Qaidu, and the rise of Dua Khan. I'm your host David, and this is Kings and Generals, Ages of Conquest. The territory which became the Ulus of Chagatai was conquered by the Mongols in two stages. The eastern half of the Ulus, in what is now southeastern Kazakhstan and northwest Xinjiang, was taken peacefully when Jev Noyan overran the empire of Karakitai in 1218 and 1219. As covered back in episode 8, the fleeing Naiman prince Wushlug had fled to Karakitai and usurped power there. When Jev invaded, Wushlug ran for his life, leaving the cities of his new empire defenseless. The lack of defense was ironically beneficial, as they largely submitted peacefully, and the former Karakitai troops joined their new Mongol overlords. The more densely populated western half of the empire was not so lucky. This region, including Transoxiana and the Fergana Valley in modern southern Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, down to Turkmenistan, was controlled by the Khwarezmian Empire and was violently crushed by Chinggis Khan in the first years of the 1220s, as we saw in episode 9. Each site that put up resistance fell victim to the Khan's wrath. The destruction not just of cities, but of agriculture and irrigation canals. The toll on the population was horrific. Perhaps millions were killed in the course of the conquest. Perhaps as many died from the ensuing starvation, spread of disease, and banditry. Thousands upon thousands were displaced from their homes or transported elsewhere on Mongol order. The initial governors set over the region and cities did little to help, simply bringing more taxation and material demands onto the population. Chinggis Khan's second son Chagatai stayed in the region after the conquest. Contrary to popular belief, Chinggis did not divide his empire among his sons in order for them to become distinct states. Rather, they were each allotted territory within the empire in order to support themselves. Chagatai was granted much of the former Khwarezmian and Karakitai realms and the basis of the Ulus of Chagatai. Stern and demanding, Chagatai had little care for city life or the cultures of the people he ruled over. He was a man of the steppe, and his reign was spent in the steppe. Though he maintained a quasi-capital at Al-Malik near modern Kulja, northwestern Xinjiang on the Ili River, Chagatai resided in his summer and winter pastures. Al-Malik served to collect tribute and house his treasures, his officials, and receive messengers from the court. Reconstruction of the conquered territories was not his concern. His engineers were used to build large pools for waterfowl to flock to for Chagatai to hunt. Now, that's not to say that Chagatai had no interaction with his subjects. Chagatai was a strict upholder of the Yasa and the Yosun, the laws and customs of his father, Chinggis Khan. We've mentioned in previous episodes that there was conflict on who these laws should apply to, that is, just nomads, or to the sedentarized populations of the empire as well. Well, Chagatai was of the opinion that everyone was subject to the laws, which were to be enforced as strictly as possible. Laws against theft were violently enforced. The Persian historian Juvaini, writing in the mid-1250s, who worked for the Mongols and spent quite some time in the Chagatai realm, wrote this famous passage you may have heard variations of. For fear of his yasa and punishment, his followers were so well disciplined that during his reign no traveler, so long as he was near his army, had need of guard or patrol on any stretch of road, and, as is said by way of hyperbole, a woman with a golden vessel on her head might walk alone without fear or dread. The presence of Chagatai was enough to discourage thievery, although the quote has often been taken out of context to suggest a woman could walk across all of Asia under Mongol rule and not face any danger. While a strict enforcer of the Yasa's proclamations against theft, Chagatai was more infamous in the Muslim world for the anti-Islamic aspects of the Yasa. Though the Mongols have a popular image as a beacon of religious liberty, this has been overstated. Though often tolerant in the most literal sense, as in they just tolerated certain religions seen as useful, the Mongols were less accommodating when they found that a religion conflicted with their own customs. The Yasa, for instance, mandated the method in which an animal must be slaughtered, crushing the heart and not letting any blood spill. Needlessly spilled blood on the ground was a great offense to the spirits. The halal method of slaughter prescribed by Islam, though, requires cutting the throat and draining the blood. The two methods were inherently contradictory, and conflicts often arose from Mongols attempting to ban halal slaughter. Immediately after describing how Chagatai's army dissuaded theft, Giovanni wrote the following: "And he enacted minute yasa that were an intolerable imposition upon such as the Taziks, so that none might slaughter meat in the Muslim fashion, nor sit by day in running water, and so on. The yasa forbidding the slaughter of sheep in the lawful manner he sent to every land, and for a time no man slaughtered sheep openly in Khorasan, and Muslims were forced to eat carrion." Chagatai may not have specifically hated Muslims or been a man of constantly boiling rage, as he's often portrayed by modern authors. He certainly employed Muslims in the top ranks of his bureaucracy. We should probably imagine him better as an uncompromising figure seeking to stringently enforce his father's laws. It just so happened that this enforcement was quite harmful to Muslims caught in the crosshairs. From the Mongol point of view, you could still be a Muslim as long as you did not practice these certain customs the Mongols disliked, such as spilling blood or washing dirty things in running water. The nuance made little difference to the Muslims of Central Asia, to whom Chagatai consistently appeared as a tormentor in the sources. Juzjani, a Khwarezmian refugee to the Delhi Sultanate in India, wrote in the 1250s and describes Chagatai as a demonic figure who wanted to exterminate the Muslims. Often, Chagatai is used in these sources as a contrast to Qho'Oğei, usually depicted as generous and a friend to Islam. Qho'Oğei's enthronement as Khan of Khans in 1229 certainly was a benefit to the Muslims of the empire. At the start of his reign, Qho'Oğei created another governmental layer, the Secretariat system. Check out episode 13 for more on this. While the North China Branch Secretariat has received greater attention in our series, at the same time a branch secretariat for Turkestan, or Central Asia, was established to oversee the populations under Chagatai's rule and strengthen the Great Khan's authority there. The man chosen to head the department was a good choice, a native of Khwarezm called Mahmud Yalavach. Mahmud Yalavach and his son Masud Beg were perhaps the two longest-serving ministers of the Mongols, and the two have often weaved their way in and out of our series. Mahmud Yalavach's early life is unknown, other than he hailed from Khwarezm. The great Russian Orientalist Vasily Bartold suggested that Mahmud Yalavach is identical to Mahmud Bey, the vizier of the final Gur Khan of the Kara Hittai. Yalavach first reliably appears as a part of Chinggis Khan's 1218 embassy to the Khwarezmian Empire, where he is identified as Mahmud Khwarezmi. Taken aside by the Khwarezm Shah Muhammad II, Mahmud deftly handled their interaction, and for the mission he earned the title of Yalavach, Turkic for messenger or ambassador. Staying in Mongol service, in 1229, Qho'Oğei appointed him manager of the branch secretariat for Central Asia. Yalavach, assisted by his son Masud Beg, proved a very capable man, and under him the first genuine reconstruction efforts after the Mongol conquest were implemented. At his direction, with the backing of Great Khan Qho'Oğei, cities and irrigation systems were rebuilt, agriculture encouraged and revitalized, a new tax system implemented, and efforts to clamp down on extraordinary levies on the part of Chagatai and his sons were enacted. His efforts were successful. Several contemporary sources agree to the restoration of prosperity to the region, corroborated by numismatic evidence. Yalavach's first decade in charge of the Central Asian Branch Secretariat was a much-needed salve for the region, though he faced competition from Chagatai, who did not take kindly to his brother's officers' interference. At the first opportunity he would get, Chagatai would undermine Yalavach. In 1238, an unexpected crisis emerged from one of the chief cities of Transoxiana, Bukhara. There, a sieve maker named Mahmud Tarabi became a popular figure on account of his supposed magical capabilities and ability to communicate with jinn. Giovanni says that, according to reputable individuals with whom he spoke with in Bukhara, one of Tarabi's spells included making a medicine from dog feces and blowing it into the eyes of the blind, which restored their sight. Giovanni did not have a high opinion of him, also remarking that in regards to his stupidity and ignorance, Tarabi had no equal. Tarabi developed quite a reputation for magic and miracles, encouraged by a local notable named Shams ad-Din Mahbubi, who, through his personal vendetta against Bukhara's leadership and the Mongols, encouraged Tarabi's pretensions. How the very planets were aligned in his favor. Mahbubi told him, even going as far, Giovanni says, speaking of a prophecy, that a man from Tarabi's home village of Tarab would conquer the world. Unfortunately for Tarabi, there was some very stiff competition for such a claim. Mahmud Yalavach was alerted to the bubbling unrest in Bukhara gathering around Tarabi and sought to lure the man out and kill him. Tarabi saw through the trap and evaded it, which escalated his troublemaking. His inflammatory speeches to the people of Bukhara riled them up, and his claims of support from the invisible hosts of heaven seemed to have been given some merit when a merchant with a shipment of swords had his wares fall into Tarabi's hands. With his followers now armed, Tarabi, as all good prophets do, collected around himself riches and women. Convinced of their power, they killed or drove out the Bukharan government and Mongolian representatives. A response force was rallied, likely local militia under the command of regional Darugashi. Mahbubi and Tarabi marched out of Bukhara at the head of their army, convinced of their divine protection. Neither wore armor or weapon, and spread rumors that whoever rose a hand against them would be struck down, paralyzed. The response force was worried and only set off a volley of arrows when the wind picked up a dust storm. Frightened that this was some trick of Tarabi, the response force fled, and Tarabi's army doggedly pursued. They caught up to the response force and killed a great many. Upon returning to Bukhara, they were unable to find either Tarabi or Mahbubi. Giovanni asserts that both were struck by arrows in the volley set off by the government forces and killed, though it went unnoticed by both the Bukharan and the government forces. Regardless, under new local leadership, Tarabi's army turned to looting and pillaging the countryside. So they remained occupied for a week until a proper Mongol army arrived, either imperial troops or sent by Chagatai. The Bukharan forces went up confident towards them, believing defeated local militia was the same as defeating the horsemen of the Great Khan. The first volley of arrows killed the leadership of the Bukharan forces, and within hours, 20,000 of the late Tarabi's followers had joined them. The following day, the Mongols were leading the citizens of Bukhara onto the plain before the city, preparing to unleash a horrific massacre as punishment. Only the intervention of Mahmud Yalavach, with approval of Great Khan Qho'Oğei, was this averted and the population spared, probably to the displeasure of Chagatai. The Tarabi revolt, however, had undermined Yalavach's credibility. Later in 1239, when Chagatai sought to transfer territory under Yalavach's supervision to another official, something which under the secretariat system Chagatai lacked the power to do, Yalavach complained to Qho'Oğei. Ögedei agreed with Yalovach's complaint, but to smooth things over with his brother, removed Yalovach from his office. But to demonstrate that he was not doing this to allow imperial prerogative to slip, Ögedei immediately appointed Yalovach's son, Masud Beg, to his father's position at head of the Central Asian Secretariat, while Yalovach would, in the final months of Ögedei's life in 1241, be appointed to head the Secretariat in North China after Yellow Chutai's demotion. Masud Beg was just as capable as his father and dedicated himself to the reconstruction of Central Asia, but with little progress over the 1240s. Ögedei had little energy for governance in his final years, and when he died in December 1241, Chagatai was the chief figure of the empire, the senior Chinggisid. Chagatai's support for the regency of Ögedei's widow, Qho'Oğei, helped ensure her position, but the last son of Chinggis Khan soon died of illness in 1242. Chagatai's favorite son, Motugen, had died during the Khwarezmian campaign. He moved his choice of heir to another young son, but he too died early. Finally, Chagatai decided on son of Motugen, Qho'Oğei, to be his heir. Qho'Oğei was quickly confirmed into his father's position in 1242 and largely cooperated in both financial policy and personnel with the regent Qho'Oğei Khatun. Therefore, Masud Beg had to flee to Batu, chief of the Jochids, as Qho'Oğei threatened both him and his father Yalovach, men she saw as her enemies. This period we covered back in episode 20. Qho'Oğei's son Guyuk became Great Khan in 1246, welcoming Masud Beg and Mahmud Yalovach back to their positions, but deposing Qho'Oğei. Instead, Guyuk Khan appointed his friend, a son of Chagatai named Yesu Monke, as the new Khan of the Chagatais. Yesu Monke was good at exactly one thing, the sources all agree: drinking. After Guyuk's death in 1248, the former Khan, Qho'Oğei, and his clever wife, Orkina, wisely backed the new contender for the throne, Tului's son, Monke. When Monke became Khan of Khans in 1251, he undertook a massacre of princes of the line of Ögedei and Chagatai who had opposed him and plotted against him. As we saw in episode 21, Monke essentially dissolved the Ulus of Ögedei, and while the territory of the Chagatais remained intact, their ranks were thinned. Guyuk's appointed Chagatai Khan, Yesu Monke, was deposed and eventually killed on Monke's order, and Qho'Oğei was rewarded for his loyalty with the Khanate again. Masud Beg and Mahmud Yalovach were reconfirmed in their positions in Central Asia and China. Everyone set out from Karakorum to return to their posts, except for Qho'Oğei, who died en route. His young son, Mubarak Shah, was duly enthroned as Khan of the Chagatais, with his mother, Qho'Oğei's widow, Orkina Khatun, as regent. She was a good choice, an intelligent and shrewd woman who understood the dynamics of the Chagatai realm well. She was well respected, as she had been held in esteem by Chagatai himself, and as granddaughter of Chinggis Khan via his daughter, Qho'Oğei, and a prince of the Oirats, she was of distinguished lineage. Over the 1250s, Orkina Khatun, in cooperation with Masud Beg, furthered the reconstruction of Central Asia. According to Juvaini, in the 1250s, Transoxiana finally reached the level of prosperity it had held before the Mongol conquest. Fully backed by Monke Khan, who also married her aunt, strengthening their connection, Orkina may as well have been the Chagatai Khan herself. The Mongol Empire saw a number of female regents over the 1240s and 50s, and Orkina may have well been the most capable. She gave Masud Beg full support and materials to restore the economic power of the region. Both became quite wealthy through their efforts, as they had had enough money to personally endow madrasas. When Monke Khan's brother Qho'Oğei passed through the region in 1253 en route to his Iran campaign, Orkina Khatun hosted lavish banquets for Qho'Oğei and his wives, who happened to be Orkina's sister and half-sister. The height of the Chagatai Khanate was probably this decade under Orkina Khatun and Masud Beg's governance. The Chagataids enjoyed their best relationship with the imperial government, having the full backing of Grand Khan Möngke. The trade routes prospered, cities were rebuilt, their economies restored, and the region had a period of relative peace, and the horrors of the conquest began to slip into the past. There is some indication that the realm may have been, in this time, called something like the Ulus of Orgina. The Franciscan friar William of Rubric, who passed through the region in the early 1250s, reported that he heard it called Organum. The term is of uncertain origin. Rubric himself didn't know where it came from, and there is debate in the scholarship if it actually refers to Orgina, with a number of alternative suggestions made, such as it coming from the name of Orgench, the capital of Khwarezm. But it is terribly coincidental, though, that Rubric would use such a rare term with more than a passing similarity to the name of the lady ruling the area skillfully at the exact same time. As with so many things, this came to a crash with Möngke Khan's death on campaign in 1259. Orgina Khatun and her kinsmen supported Möngke's brother Arik Bokeh in his declaration as Khan of Khans, which put them at odds with Möngke's older brother, Kublai. Kublai in 1260 sought to place a more amenable figure on the Chagataid throne in order to deny Arik an ally, and sent a great-grandson of Chagatai named Abishka to depose or marry Orgina Khatun. Arik Bokeh arrested and executed Kublai's Chagatai prince, but soon decided he needed his own man leading the Chagataids. Orgina was a skilled administrator, but no military leader, and she may not have been willing to allow Arik to use her realm as a supply depot for war against Kublai, who had access to all the materials of North China. In 1261, Arik had Orgina removed and placed Algu, another grandson of Chagatai, onto the throne. Orgina came to Arik's court and basically spent the next 2 years criticizing him for the action. As you undoubtedly know by now, as we covered in episode 32, the war between Arik Bokeh and Kublai did not go well for Arik. Algu turned out to be unreliable, denying Arik his supplies and backing Kublai. Soon after, Orgina Khatun left Arik Bokeh, returning to the Chagatai Khanate, where Algu forced her into marriage. Orgina was very popular among the Chagataids, and it seems Algu struggled for legitimacy. Marrying the influential Orgina was Algu's best solution. To seal the agreement, Algu made her young son Mubarak Shah his designated heir, and once more confirmed the great administrator Masud Beg over Transoxiana. Arik Bokeh was furious at Algu's betrayal and, in his frustration, invaded the Chagatai Khanate, attacking al-Malik, but was soon, due to famine and desertion, forced to surrender to Kublai. His victory complete, Kublai confirmed Algu and Orgina as the masters of the Chagataids. With the war between the Tuluids settled, but the Great Khan's influence severely curtailed in Central Asia, Algu was free to strengthen himself as an independent monarch. He had to deal with an upstart Ogadid prince on his northern border, however, a young man named Qaidu. Qaidu managed to defeat Algu's forces in a first battle, but Algu regrouped and defeated Qaidu late in 1265. Poised to invade Qaidu's small dominion, matters seemed bleak for Qaidu until Algu suddenly died at the start of 1266. This much-needed reprieve for Qaidu would define the Chagatais for the rest of the 13th century. As per their agreement, on Algu's death, Orgina Khatun finally placed her son, Mubarak Shah, on the Chagataid throne in March 1266. This is the last known event of Orgina Khatun's life, and it seems she died soon after enthroning her son. Apparently, this was done without the approval of Kublai Khan, as when Kublai learned of this, he sent another grandson of Chagatai from his court, Barak. Only months into his reign and some 15 years since his father's death, Mubarak Shah Khan was captured by Barak and made his prisoner. The new Chagatai Khan, Barak, won his first victory over Qaidu, but when Qaidu returned back with troops from the Golden Horde, sent by the Jochid Khan Möngke Temur, Barak was sent onto the back foot. He pillaged Bukhara and Samarkand to fund a new army, starting the first round of undoing Mahmud Yalavach and Masud Beg's work. Even worse, it was for naught. Qaidu and Möngke Temür sent emissaries for a truce, and so either in 1267 on the Katwan steppe or in 1269 at Talas, Chagatai Khan Barak, the Ogaden Prince Qaidu, and representatives of the Jochid Khan Möngke Temür made peace. They divided the revenue of Transoxiana between them, with 2/3 going to Barak and 1/3 to be split between Qaidu and Möngke Temür. Pastures were divided between them, princes and troops were forbidden to enter cities, Masud Beg was to be placed in control of administering the sedentary population, and Barak and Qaidu became Anda, blood brothers. Promising to support Barak in an invasion of the Ilkhanate, they apparently also sent a joint letter to Kublai criticizing his Sinicization. The Peace of Talas can be considered a definitive end to Mongol imperial unity. For now, the princes divided the empire between themselves. Though a peace, it was an uneasy one, and one dependent on turning their energies against other Mongols. Late in 1269, in preparation for his invasion of the Ilkhanate, Barak encouraged a Chagataid prince who served the Ilkhans to desert. Ilkhan Abaka, son of Hulegu, swiftly crushed the prince's attempt near Derband. In 1270, Barak entered Ilkhanid territory in Khorasan in what is now northeastern Iran and Afghanistan. Accompanying him was a large body of soldiers from Qaidu. Barak's army devastated much of Khorasan, overrunning Badakhshan, Shaburgan, Talikan, Merv, and Nishapur in the first months of 1270, undoing much of the recovery these places had had since the invasions of Chinggis 50 years prior. Barak won a victory over Abaka Ilkhan's brother Tubshin and the long-serving governor of the region, Argun Aka, causing them to flee to Abaka and warn him of the danger. But Qaidu had given explicit orders to his own men. After the victory over Tubshin, a disagreement between Qaidu's commanders and Barak's was used as a pretext for Qaidu's men to abandon Barak. Barak was incensed and sent some men to pursue, all the while giving valuable time for Abaka Ilkhan to mobilize his forces. Barak then turned his attention on Herat in northern Afghanistan in July of 1270. But Abaka was already on the march, and the Georgian forces in Abaka's vanguard surprised and destroyed Barak's advance force. Barak pulled his men back after the brief clash, with Abaka keeping his large army mostly hidden. Abaka then sent a peace embassy to Barak, and Barak seems to have momentarily considered, then promptly sent a small group of spies to find and track Abaka's army. Abaka captured the spies, executing all but one when he had a terribly clever idea, absolutely devious in fact. Leaving one spy tied up but near feasting troops, Abaka had his troops in a panic abandon their camp and make much noise that an army of the Golden Horde had crossed the Caucasus and Abaka needed to pull back to deal with it. The spy was allowed to escape and report his news back to Barak, who was positively delighted. He quickly advanced, crossing the Herat River, and plundered Abaka's deserted camp, then moved leisurely onto a nearby plain, where he found Abaka's larger army drawn up for battle. Barak had fallen into the trap, but he was not going to roll over for Abaka. Barak's Chagatai horsemen led the first charge, unleashing a volley of arrows into the Ilkhanid forces. Devastating cycle charges of 1,000 horse archers ravaged the Ilkhanid lines, the apparently lighter-equipped Chagatais too mobile for the heavier Ilkhanid cavalry. One of Barak's chief commanders was struck down by an arrow, but they resumed the attack, and their repeated charges pushed back the Ilkhan's center and left. Abaka considered retreating, but was encouraged by his generals to stick to the field. Redeploying his forces, gradually the Ilkhan encircled Barak's army. In a last attempt, Barak personally led charges against the Ilkhan until knocked from his horse. According to Rashid al-Din, the grounded Barak shouted at his men, "I am Barak, give me a horse!" until finally acquiring a horse and riding off the field, pursued by the Ilkhanid troops for 2 days. One of Barak's commanders continued to fight, holding off the Ilkhans long enough to allow a number of Chagatai troops to escape as well. So ended the Battle of Herat, July 1270, ensuring Ilkhanid domination of Khorasan. Abaka's preoccupation with Barak allowed the Mamluks to take Tripoli, and the defeat of Barak ended up allowing Qaidu to dominate Central Asia for the next 30 years. Barak reached Bukhara, where he soon fell deadly ill. Qaidu sent troops to capture Barak, but in August 1271 found that Barak had succumbed to his illness. The captive Mubarak Shah used this opportunity to plunder Barak's camp and steal his possessions, even the jewelry of his widows, before fleeing to the Ilkhanate with his sister. Qaidu was now the dominant power in the Chagatai Khanate, a period we largely covered in episode 41. Only a month after Barak's death, Qaidu was declared Khan of the Oghadids and appointed his first Chagatai Khan. His initial efforts to instill control were difficult, as sons of Algu, Barak, and the puppet Chagatai Khan himself rebelled. It would not be until 1282 when Qaidu was able to impose his authority, placing Dua, a son of Barak, onto the throne of Chagatai. Dua and Qaidu had a very effective partnership and channeled the energies of their combined khanates against the Yuan dynasty, Ilkhanate, and even India. It brought much-needed peace to the region internally, even if the overland trade routes, the famed Silk Roads, were disrupted by their warfare. The aging Masud Beg was heartbroken when Abaka Ilkhan preemptively attacked and sacked Bukhara in 1273, and the city was sacked again in 1276 by the rebellious sons of Algu and Barak. Masud Beg must have been pleased for some sense of stability with Dua and Qaidu's partnership, and continued to do what he could to rebuild until his death in 1289. So honored was he that Qaidu and Dua had Masud's son immediately take his stead. Dua and Qaidu certainly did what they could do to encourage trade and growth, and even constructed cities, though they did not live in them. Their direction of the energies of their warriors against their foes must have helped keep rapacious nomads away from the fragile economic centers within the Khanates. It certainly allowed for expansion of their influence. In the 1290s, Dua, with Qaidu's support, exerted his authority over Ghazni in Afghanistan and the fearsome Neguderis there. His eldest son, Kutlu Khwaja, was appointed to head them, and from that base conducted raids on northern India at the same time as Dua and Qaidu led their armies into Yuan territory in northwestern China. Chagatai raids on the Ilkhanate in the 1290s reached as far as Mazandaran, Fars, and Kirman, and they even tried to put their own claimant on the throne of the Blue Horde between the Caspian and Aral seas. The final years of this effective partnership, as we covered in quite some detail in episode 41, ended in 1301 with Qaidu's death against Yuan forces. At the start of the 14th century, Dua was master of Central Asia and the Chagatai Khanate. In our next episode, we will pick up with Dua's reign and the long shadow he cast over the Chagatais, namely in the form of all of his sons, who basically each took a turn being Khan. So be sure to subscribe to the Kings and Generals podcast to follow. If you enjoyed this and would like to help us continue bringing you great content, please consider supporting us on Patreon at www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. This episode was researched and written by our series historian, Jack Wilson. I'm your host, David, and we will catch you on the next one.